Continuation of Chapter 7. Fourth Liberty, Liberty of Conscience. Finally, Leo XIII treats of liberty of conscience, taking care to distinguish, for words, if they are not defined, are always ambiguous. Quote, "If by this is meant that everyone may, as he chooses, worship God or not, it is sufficiently refuted by the arguments already adduced. But it may also be taken to mean that every man in the state may follow the will of God, and from a consciousness of duty, and free from every obstacle, obey his commands. This indeed is true liberty, a liberty worthy of the sons of God, which nobly maintains the dignity of man, and is stronger than all violence or wrong, a liberty which the Church has always desired and held most dear. This is the kind of liberty the apostles claimed for themselves with intrepid constancy, which the apologists of Christianity confirmed by their writings, and which the martyrs in vast numbers consecrated by their blood." End quote. A culpable and fatal ambiguity. Nowadays, ambiguities are tolerated. A few years ago, during the canonization of some Irish martyrs, Paul VI gave a discourse riddled with ambiguities. He played on the phrase, quote, "freedom of conscience," as if these martyrs had manifested the necessity of this freedom, as if they had died for it. But these martyrs understood freedom of conscience as Pope Leo XIII was to define it, the freedom to affirm the truth and to adhere to it. But if it is a question of defending the freedom of every religion, or of every thought, that is a completely different matter. It is not for this that they went to be martyred. They refused to become Protestants, because that is error. Thus they were massacred for truth's sake, and not for the sake of the freedom of every opinion. To play upon the blood of these martyrs who manifested their attachment to the true faith, in order to make it seem that they died to defend the freedom of all religion, is inadmissible. Nowadays, people demand freedom of religion without defining it, but here one must make oneself clear. To defend a certain freedom, the freedom of individuals, so that there are no unwarranted investigations by the state into what persons believe and which might be followed by persecutions, is very good. It is also good to prevent people from being invaded in the privacy of their home because they profess a false religion, Muslim or Buddhist, for example. But to give the impression that the Church defends the freedom of all religions is inadmissible, because she cannot defend the freedom of error. To demand freedom for all religions to be able, like the Catholic religion, to disseminate their doctrine, have a press, institutions, schools, and temples, is to enter a dangerous terrain, because soon one will see temples and mosques everywhere, and the Catholics will not be able to say anything, since they themselves wanted to grant freedom to error. True tolerance. Later on, Pope Leo XIII speaks of tolerance. That this should be necessary in states is understandable. But it is one thing to tolerate, and another thing to admit a right. One tolerates evil, but one does not approve it. A parallel can be drawn to ourselves. We are sinners. We have evil tendencies, but we are not going to kill ourselves because we cannot tolerate our vices. We must bear with ourselves to a certain degree, without, however, approving our vices. We bear them while trying to combat them and re-establish order within ourselves. The same thing is true of societies. They are sick. To want to suppress every evil would make social life impossible. One is not going to kill society. The states are thus obliged to tolerate certain things. Formerly, for example, they used to call, quote, houses of toleration what were nothing other than houses of prostitution. The state deemed it necessary to tolerate these because by wanting to suppress these houses entirely, the consequence would have been for prostitution to spread everywhere clandestinely, which would have been worse than regulating it. It is the duty of the state to decide if it must tolerate something or not. Thus Catholic states and Catholic princes, who prosecuted vice and public sin, tolerated these houses. Yet it was a very restricted liberty. About tolerance, Pope Leo XIII writes, quote, yet, with the discernment of a true mother, the Church weighs the great burden of human weakness, and well knows the course down which the minds and actions of men are in this our age being borne. For this reason, while not conceding any right to anything save what is true and honest, she does not forbid public authority to tolerate what is at variance with truth and justice, for the sake of avoiding some greater evil, or of obtaining or preserving some greater good. End quote. The Pope recalls that God himself permits evil without willing it. He cannot will evil, but he permits it for the sake of a greater good, or to avoid a greater evil. To tolerate does not mean to recognize a right. Prior to Vatican II, two schemas were drafted, the one by Cardinal Bea on religious liberty, and the other by Cardinal Ottaviani, which spoke of, quote, de tolerantia religiosa. They were in violent opposition, and in the midst of a meeting, Cardinal Bea raised his voice to proclaim, quote, I do not agree with this schema at all. Yet, religious toleration is truly the traditional doctrine of the Church, for whom it is entirely impossible to speak of freedom of religions. In certain cases, error is tolerated, but it is never admitted to be a natural right. For example, in countries like Germany, where there are equal numbers of Catholics and Protestants, it is impossible to suppress Protestantism. But in completely Catholic states like Spain, where there were very few Protestants, laws favored Catholicism and impeded the development of Protestant institutions. And this was the policy until Franco, under pressure from the Vatican, at last granted freedom to the sects. Consequently, the Protestants became more numerous, and the Jehovah's Witnesses arrived on the scene. The same thing happened in Latin America, where the countries were 95% Catholic. The heads of state followed the principles declared by the popes and considered it an obligation to protect their Catholic people from the errors that would have destroyed the faith. This is quite normal when one believes in our Lord Jesus Christ, and it was beautiful to see the faith officially professed in these countries. In the processions and the official religious ceremonies, representatives of the civil authority were always present. It was a great example for the population. But this was suppressed. These states have become laic, and subsequently an invasion of the sects has followed. In Chile, temples crop up everywhere. Mormons, Adventists, the Salvation Army. As soon as the Church lacks firmness in upholding her principles, and the clergy lacks the courage of its convictions, the Catholic faith is encroached upon. The faithful abandon it and join the sects. It is normal for the Church, then, to tolerate what it cannot prevent, as in a place where there is a majority of non-Catholics. But the heads of state can only offer the dissidents tolerance. They cannot admit their possession of any natural right. Quote, "But to judge aright, we must acknowledge that the more a state is driven to tolerate evil, the further it is from perfection, and that the tolerance of evil, which is dictated by political prudence, should be strictly confined to the limits which its justifying cause, the public welfare, requires. One thing, however, remains always true, that the liberty which is claimed for all to do all things is not, as we have often said, of itself desirable, inasmuch as it is contrary to reason that error and truth should have equal rights. And as to tolerance, it is surprising how far removed from the equity and prudence of the Church are those who profess what is called liberalism." End quote.